My object is to preserve an illustrated record of this unique phase of the World War, made up from photographs actually taken during the campaign, some of which I was fortunate enough to take myself. If it helps to dispel certain doubts as to the justification of the revolt and increases our understanding of the Arabs, this small effort will have been well rewarded. On Lawrence's advice, there are two things I want to stress. One, the local nature of the revolt. Arabs, Mohammedans, outside the boundaries specified on the maps were not involved. Two, the aim of the revolt was to free from Turkey and make self-governing not the Bedouin, who have a secure unenvied freedom, but the settled peoples of Syria and Iraq. Map of tribes. Our first slide shows us a map of Arabia with the names of the Arab tribes who took part in the revolt, 1915-1918, against the domination of the Turks, oppressors of the Arabs, for over 400 years. Each tribe was ruled by its appointed sheikh, forming a number of independent and often hostile units, characterized by their unbending pride, courage, and poetic fancy. The sheriffs, i.e. members of the Prophet's family, were considered to be above tribal jealousies, and the Grand Sheriff of Mecca, Hussein, was nominally their ruler. Just over 40 years ago, the Arabs had allowed Charles Doughty, an Englishman and author of Travels in Arabia Deserta, a masterpiece in English literature, to wander in their forbidden provinces. Lawrence, in his preface to Doughty's book, says, "The Western Arabs in these 40 years had learned enough of the ideas of Europe to accept nationality as a basis for action. They accepted it so thoroughly that they went into battle against their caliph, the Sultan of Turkey, to win their right to a national freedom. The hostility which had been directed against Christians became directed against the foreigner who presumed to interfere in the domestic affairs of Arabic-speaking provinces. The Turks in vain tried to stir up a holy war against the Christians, and we find the Mohammedan Arabs accepting the help of non-believers, Christians, to throw off the yoke of their Mohammedan masters, the Turks." Map, first phase. In 1909, the Turks completed their railway, built on the old pilgrim route from Damascus to Medina. It served the double purpose of affording an easy route for pilgrims to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, and gave a much greater control of the ports and towns on the Red Sea to the Turks. With the outbreak of the World War, the possibilities of a successful Arab revolt were being discussed by secret Arab societies in various parts of the Ottoman Empire, and in 1915 the Arabs under Faisal, the third son of the Grand Sheriff Hussein of Mecca, raised the banner of revolt outside Medina. At this time, the Turks were holding a line south of Gaza and Beersheba in Palestine against the British, the Red Sea ports of the Hejaz, and the Pilgrims' Railway in Arabia, with strong forces in Man, Mecca, and Medina. Faisal and his army made a desperate rush on Medina, but the Arab tribes, unused to artillery and machine gun fire, were driven back into the open plains. The personal bravery of Faisal, riding alone amongst the enemy shell bursts, failed to draw his men again to the charge. The Turks treacherously massacred innocent Arab men, women and children in a suburb of Medina as a lesson in Turkish revenge, but instead of frightening the Arabs, made them determined to fight to the last man. Mecca, interior of the Holy Mosque. Meanwhile, Faisal's father, Hussein, succeeded in capturing Mecca at the first rush, but the Turkish forts on the surrounding hills were foolish enough to shell this holy mosque, which you see in the picture, killing several worshippers actually praying before the sacred carpet-covered cubical stone called the Kaaba. A second shudder of horror ran through the Mohammedan world. As the birthplace of the Prophet Muhammad and the scene of the annual pilgrimage, Mecca is the holy city of the Mohammedan world. The Kaaba was said to have been founded by Abraham, and the covering, which you see, is known as the Holy Carpet. A new silk carpet is made each year in one of the great Mohammedan cities and is carried in procession from Jeddah to the holy city, the old carpet being cut up into strips and sold to the faithful. Openings in the silk are left to show two sacred stones which the Mohammedans believe to have fallen from heaven. No Christians are allowed in this mosque. A few have entered at the risk of their lives. Hussein, now in command of Mecca, was content to stay there for the remainder of the revolt. Meanwhile, Faisal made another gallant but unsuccessful attack on Medina, after which he fell back with his main body to a wadi valley near the coast. Faisal was greatly discouraged. He had experienced heavy losses, money was running short, and his army was gradually melting away. At this point in the history of the revolt, Lawrence appeared in his search for a real leader for the Arab cause. Lawrence, whom you now see dressed in Arab clothes given to him by Faisal, is one of the most baffling and romantic figures of the Great War. His friends range from kings to tramps, and he seems able to turn a suitable side to each. Quiet and unassuming in manner, he has a remarkable power of instilling confidence in others. Perhaps only those who have read the 7 Pillars of Wisdom, or who have had the privilege of knowing him and seeing him in a variety of difficult circumstances, can fully appreciate his unique abilities. His power of mental detachment is so great that at times he seems oblivious of physical hardships. The Arabs came to love him, and his name will be in their songs and poems for many generations to come. In October 1916, Lawrence, already a master of many Arab dialects, arrived at Jeddah, the port of Mecca, during his fortnight's leave from his duties as intelligence officer to GHQ Cairo, to investigate for himself the possibilities of the Arab revolt. At this stage, his object was to find an Arab leader capable of leading and sustaining the enthusiasm of the Arabs. We will now take a brief tour through Jeddah, the port on the Red Sea at which Lawrence and Storrs, afterwards the first Christian governor of Jerusalem since the Crusades, were met by Abdullah, the second son of Hussein, Sheriff of Mecca. The Gate of Jeddah. Here is the Gate of Jeddah, a well-known sight to thousands of Mohammedans who make the annual pilgrimage to the holy city of Mecca. Note the type of arch favored by Arab architects, the flat roofs and decorative windows. The buildings reflect the lazy indifference of the town Arabs to the needs of the future, repairs evidently postponed until it is too late. A market street in Jeddah. Here we see the street littered with the stalls of the merchants, with a minaret in the centre, from which the faithful are called to prayer at the rise and setting of the sun. Picture in your imagination this street at the time of the pilgrimage, the incessant babble of buyers and sellers competing for each other's wares, men, camels and donkeys jostling together in indescribable confusion, create a very fair picture of an Eastern market. Peculiar foundation of houses in Jeddah. This picture shows a row of Arab dwellings. The outside is imposing and beautiful, the inside the reverse. They reflect the Arab's love of outward show at the cost of inside convenience. Dirt and dilapidation to the Arab mind apparently does not detract from beauty. Jeddah, the port you have just seen, was captured from the Turks by the Arabs with the assistance of the British Navy, at about the same moment as Mecca fell to Hussein's charge and became a temporary base for supplies and stores of the Arab army. Sheriff Abdullah. As Lawrence and Storrs entered Jeddah, Abdullah, Hussein's second son and now king of Transjordania, mounted on a white mare and accompanied by a guard of richly armed slaves, came to meet them. Abdullah had just returned from capturing the town of Taif, inland from Mecca, which he had taken with a sudden rush and was therefore in a good humour. After hearing his account of the general situation, Lawrence came to the conclusion that Abdullah, although affable, shrewd and cheerful, was not the man to keep alive the spirit of the revolt, and he decided to seek elsewhere. After a certain amount of difficulty in overcoming the Arabs' dislike of a Christian travelling in the Holy Province, Lawrence obtained from Abdullah a letter addressed to Ali, Abdullah's elder brother, now at Rabek, a port on the Red Sea some 70 miles north, asking Ali to provide Lawrence with an escort to visit Ali's younger brother Faisal, encamped about 120 miles inland. From Jeddah, Lawrence took the boat to Rabeg, interviewed Ali, the eldest son of Sheriff Hussein, whom he discovered to be a consumptive with a nervous and moody disposition, clearly not a suitable leader for the revolt. Ali proved gracious and gave Lawrence an Arab cloak and headcloth, together with a camel and an escort to take him to Faisal's camp, 120 miles inland. Country east of Wedge. In Arabia, a guide answers with his life for that of his charge. Even so, the party were advised to travel at night to avoid all camps and questioning by strangers. The country which you see is typical of the rocky desert, roughly 60 miles from the coast, through which Lawrence and his escort had to pass. At midday, the heat in the Wadi valley tracks is suffocatingly hot, the heat beating up in waves from the rocks, and Lawrence, after 2 years of office work in Cairo, found this 120-mile ride on Arab diet very trying. His diet consisted mainly of dough, kneaded into cakes, moistened with liquid butter, and dusted with sugar. It is considered effeminate for an Arab to carry much food on his desert journeys. The camels exist on the prickly thorn obtained at grazing intervals, and well water supplied at intervals of approximately 5 days. Lawrence skillfully parried the many questions put to him by the Arabs, whose curiosity was aroused by the glimpse of khaki under his Arab cloak. Eventually the party arrived at Wadi Safra, where Faisal, the third son of Hussein and now king of Iraq, was encamped. Outside Faisal's tent. Faisal's tent is seen in the foreground, with a number of Arabs waiting to bring their grievances before their leader. Some 8,000 men were with Faisal, of whom 800 were camel fighters and the rest hillmen. They served under their own tribal sheikhs and only near their own territory, arranging for their own food and transport. Each sheikh had a company of about 100 men. The Bili, Juhayna, and Ataba tribes were serving together in friendship for the first time in the history of Arabia. The majority were thin, strong, and active. They could ride immense distances day after day, run barefoot in the heat through sands and over rocks without pain, and climb the jagged hills. Their headcloths acted in turn as a towel, handkerchief, or sack. They were hung with cartridge bandoliers and fired off their rifles for fun at every excuse. Faisal was feeding them and their families, paying £2 a month for every man and £4 extra for the use of his camel. Faisal. This picture of Faisal was taken at the peace conference in Paris, showing him in a happy and contented mood. At this time, to quote Graves, Faisal was dead tired. His eyes were bloodshot, his cheeks hollow. He looked years older than 31. For the rest, he was tall, graceful, vigorous, with a royal dignity of head and shoulders and beautiful movements. Much of his public speech was by sign and gesture. His men loved him, and he lived for nothing but his work. He always overtaxed his strength, and Lawrence was told how once after a long spell of fighting in which he had to guard himself, lead the charges, control and encourage his men, he had collapsed in a fit and been carried away from the victory, unconscious with foam on his lips. The meeting of Lawrence and Faisal is best described in Lawrence's own words. I felt at first glance that this was a man I had come to Arabia to seek, the leader who would bring the Arab revolt to full glory. Faisal looked very tall and pillar-like, very slender in his long white silk robes, and his brown headcloth bound with a brilliant scarlet and gold cord. His eyelids were dropped, and his black beard and colourless face were like a mask against the strange, still watchfulness of his body. His hands were crossed in front of him on his dagger. Faisal, after inquiring how Lawrence had found the journey, gave him the history of the revolt from the very beginning. Faisal's present plan was to attack Medina from 4 sides, thereby checking the Turkish advance on Mecca, which would give his father time to arm and train regular troops. Yenbo. This is a picture of Yenbo, the port for Medina, to which Lawrence returned after his interview with Faisal. After seeing Faisal's army, Lawrence had decided that the tribesmen were good for irregular fighting and defence only. They were too independent to fight a pitched battle under a single command. They could defend the hills while a regular army was being built up at Rabeg. Lawrence went to GHQ Cairo to report and ask for stores, guns and ammunition, returning to Yenbo in December 1916 as Faisal's military advisor. On his advice, Yenbo was now the base for landing supplies for Faisal's army. At Rabeg, 4 British aeroplanes, 23 guns, mostly obsolete and of 14 different patterns, had arrived. A noisy gun was essential. To the Arab, the bigger the noise, the better the gun. The port of Wedge, 200 miles north from Yenbo up the Red Sea, held by the Turks, was Lawrence's next objective. As the capture of Wedge gave such an impetus to the revolt and provided the means of binding the independent tribes into a national movement, our pictures and narrative will deal with this phase in detail. Camel Hamla with supplies. Not only were there supplies of food, water and ammunition for a large column to arrange, but it was necessary to win the Arab tribes in the intervening country to Faisal's army. With this intention, Lawrence journeyed inland and to his surprise met Faisal and his army some 2 days' journey east. Faisal had hurried there as the Turks had routed the Harb tribesmen on guard in the valley where Lawrence had first met Faisal, nearly catching Zaid, Faisal's younger brother, asleep in his tent. Contradictory reports were flying about, and it was uncertain whether the Turks would attack Yenbo or Rabeg and go from thence to Mecca. Lawrence, now splendidly robed in Arab white silk wedding garments embroidered with gold, given to him by Faisal, raced back on his fine bay camel, another gift, by a more northerly route to organize the defence of Yenbo. Here he got into touch with Captain Boyle, who promised to come there with his British ships. Meanwhile, Faisal had been attacked in force and was falling back on Yenbo. It was feared the Johina tribe was betraying Faisal's movements. Things seemed hopeless. The work of improving Yenbo's defences was carried on in feverish haste, while searchlights at night from the ships crossed and recrossed over the plain. The attack did not come. Later it was discovered the Turks had arrived to within 3 miles of the town and had turned back, frightened by the searchlights and the blaze of the lighted ships. Preparations for the Arab attack on Wedge could now go on. Camel Hamla on the move. In addition to the supplies here being carried by camels, Lawrence arranged with Boyle to land food and water wherever needed and to carry ammunition required by this moving Arab force of some 10,000 men. It was decided to make this march to Wedge as spectacular and impressive as possible, collecting tribes as they went, thereby creating a national appeal. Many tribes joined them on this advance, the increasing numbers adding to the difficulties of watering. The Arabs were to attack from the desert, while the ships bombarded Wedge from the sea. Camel Hamla at rest. On this march, the watering difficulties for so large a force became acute. The ships were unable to provide sufficient water, and, as we see from the picture, the grazing for the camels was scarce. It was decided to break the army into sections, sending them forward one after another, to save delay at watering at the few wells or ponds on the line of march. The sections were to meet at a place 50 miles east of Wedge, and the attack to take place on the 23rd of January 1917. Women tending goats. The peasants were astounded at the large columns of Arabs, and quickly the rumour spread. All the world is moving north. The Arabs amused themselves with shouting, singing and telling stories, mostly of their own achievements. The Ajel sang of their towns left behind, the women who they might never see again, and of the great perils ahead of them. The camels loved the rhythm of the song and quickened their pace, seeming to share the enthusiasm of their riders. Lawrence had applied the match to fire the revolt, and his responsibilities grew. Nearing Wedge. The last 3 days of the advance were painful. The animals were without food, and the men came the last 50 miles on half a gallon of water and nothing to eat. From one of the ships, Lawrence heard that the attack on Wedge from the sea had been made the day before the appointed time, as it was feared the Turks would escape without a shelling. It was discovered that the Turkish governor, after urging his troops to shed the last drop of their blood defending Wedge, got on his camel and, with a few mounted men, escaped into the darkness, making for the railway 150 miles inland. The ships were called away after shelling the port, and it was not known if the Turks still held Wedge. At dawn on the 25th of January, the leading tribes of the column halted at a spot a few miles from the town, where various small scattered parties of Turks were taken prisoners. The Ajail bodyguard advanced to the attack, but met with no opposition. The British shelling had done its work, badly damaging the buildings, as may be seen from the pictures. The port of Wedge after bombardment. Wedge was now in the possession of the Arabs, and we will take a brief survey of their prize. This is the northern side of the port facing the sea. The effect of the shells on the walls can be plainly seen. Port of Wedge. Continuing south in a boat, we see the water tanks and the pipeline to the supply ship. The buildings suggest Turkish military barracks. Port of Wedge. Further south still is the minaret and a wharf for the landing of supplies. The capture of this port was important as affording a base for Lawrence's next objective, Aqaba, at the head of the Gulf. The Gate of Wedge. Entering the town, we passed through the Gate of Wedge, meeting a number of warriors, very proud of themselves. About 20 of the inhabitants had been killed, and all the shops and houses had been looted by the Arabs as a compensation for their losses. The success at Wedge stirred the British in Egypt to realize the value of the revolt and made it easier for Lawrence to get further help. A merchant in Wedge. This merchant is probably from Damascus and knows how to get full value for his goods. Valuable information could also be extracted from them. The town Arabs are held in contempt by the desert tribes. Should an alarm be given, this man would pack his wares in no time and disappear. It was not safe to have a permanent shop. A street in Wedge. The camels, as you see, are barracked in the street, which is entirely free of merchants. From the British in Egypt, Lawrence had received gold and 2 armoured cars with the promise of further help. The Arabs were delighted with the cars and the motor bicycles sent with them. They called the latter Devil's Horses, the children of the cars, and these in turn were the sons and daughters of the trains on the Pilgrims Railway. Faisal and Lawrence were now working hard to unite the thousands of hostile forces in Arabia, and the roads to Wedge swarmed with great sheikhs and volunteers riding in to swear allegiance. Faisal acted as peacemaker when blood enemies met, swearing them in on the Quran, the holy book, to observe the needs of the national revolt. In this way, Faisal gained authority over the Bedouins from Medina to a point far beyond Damascus. Lawrence mounted. Lawrence, here mounted on his fine bay camel, decided to visit Abdullah, now just northwest of Medina, to find out the possibility of successfully attacking Medina. Faisal's force had moved inland to harry the railway line east of Wedge. At dawn, Lawrence started on this 150-mile ride with a guard of 13 men of various tribes. It was a gamble with death. He was very weak with dysentery, brought on by drinking the bad water at Wedge. He had a high temperature, also boils on his back, which made camel riding painful. On the way, he had 2 fainting fits. Sheer willpower alone kept him in the saddle. He knew that should he become too ill to ride further, the tribesmen would, at the best, heal him by their one and only method, which was to burn holes in the patient's body to let the evil spirits out. When the patient screamed, they would say it was the devil in him protesting. His bodyguard of 13 proved an unlucky number. They quarrelled amongst themselves, and a Moor treacherously murdered one of the Ajail. A hurried court-martial was held, and the Moor privately executed, reducing the number to 11. In spite of these difficulties, Lawrence finally reached Abdullah's tent, where his weakness kept him helpless for the next 10 days. During this illness, Lawrence had time to formulate his plans for furthering the aims of the revolt. He wished to see the Arabs masters of Damascus. Medina was no longer a threat, and the Allies and Arabs would best be served by allowing the Turks to keep the Pilgrim Railway, just, and only just, in working order. thereby using up vast quantities of men in guard posts all down the line, which was too long to be properly defended, and so draining Lawrence's northern objectives of men, trains, and food. By frequent raids on the railway, blowing up trains and bridges, he would provide the Arabs with exciting adventures and loot, so necessary for their continued service, and in addition, it would keep the Turks in unimportant military areas. To get the feel of handling Arab raids, Lawrence now went on 2 raids on the railway, experimenting in automatic mines. Aqaba expedition starting. On April 10th, Lawrence returned to Wedge, now the base for his intended attack on Aqaba. This is a wadi near Wedge, showing the preparations in progress. While at Wedge, there was great excitement when Auda, the great fighting chief of the Hawata tribe, arrived to join Faisal's force. Faisal the prophet and Auda the warrior, each true to his type, immediately understood and liked each other. The amusing episode of Auda's teeth, described in Lawrence's book and Graves' Lawrence and the Arabs, occurred that evening at supper. The main Arab army had been committed to holding a large stretch of the railway, and Lawrence, unable to sidetrack this expedition, decided to go off with a small party, amongst whom was Auda, to capture Aqaba. He would journey northwards to catch Auda's Hawatat in the Syrian desert, raise a camel corps there, and take Aqaba from the east. This meant an encircling march of some 600 miles, including the crossing of the desolate desert, but with a good chance of success, as the Turks in Aqaba did not fear an attack from inland. A picturesque group. These are typical of the northern Arabs with whom Lawrence was now coming in contact. Notice how the headcloth is used as a protection against the heat and the flying sand. As you see, one of the dearest possessions of an Arab is his rifle. On this ride, packed with adventures, Lawrence had the additional task of mastering the northern dialects. He himself says, "As the campaign grew, it carried me from dialect to dialect, so that I never settled down to learn one properly. My teachers were my servants, and they found it easier to learn my Arabic than to teach me theirs." From Wedge, Lawrence trekked east-northeast, crossing the railway at Dizad. Here they blew up the line and cut the telegraph wires, tying the free ends to the saddles of the 6 riding camels, which they drove into the desert with a tangle of wires after them. Cutting the camels loose, they entered the desolate desert to the east, followed by shouts, curses, and bullets from the surprised Turks on the line. A fallen camel. The country proved difficult. 2 of the camels broke down and had to be shot. A dead camel is as much of an attraction to the Bedouin as a carcass is to a vulture. Here, stray Bedouins are skinning a camel. They will use the flesh for meat and the skin for leather. Before Lawrence's party had reached Nebk, 200 miles in the desert due east of Aqaba, many adventures had befallen them. One of their party was shot dead by hostile Arabs at the supper gathering. 3 others died from snake bites, and another was missing. Lawrence returned alone by their old tracks and saved this Arab's life. He was found nearly mad with the heat and thirst and brought in. Map, number 2 slide. At this stage, mentally reviewing the Arab situation, Lawrence seems to be almost overcome by the whisperings of his conscience. Was he promising the Arabs more than he could fulfill? Would the freedom to which he was leading them grow into a Frankenstein monster? Would the powers rob the Arabs of what they had won? These and many other questions worried him. He would tell Faisal all he knew and prove his good faith by refusing all decorations, rank and monies that his part in the revolt brought him personally. A decision which he kept and is keeping today. He would follow the Bedouin method of letting fate decide his problem of either carrying on with his plans or quietly effacing himself. So far from taking precautions, he would expose himself to every possible danger. Here we get a partial explanation for his undertaking what seems to be one of the maddest and most dangerous adventures in the history of the World War, a 400-mile tour through the Turks' country, marked by dotted lines on the map, with visits to their key positions without any disguise but the unbelievable folly of the journey. If the Turks were foolish enough to let him get back safely, they must pay the penalty of their folly, for he would carry the revolt through to a finish with no more qualms. On June 3, 1917, Lawrence, with a few of his bodyguard, went on his journey, still a mystery, and on June 16th, he returned safely to Nebk, armed with invaluable knowledge of the enemy's strength and dispositions, the secret of his success in the last phase of the revolt. At Nebk, Lawrence's force had swollen to 500 Arabs, and the journey east-northeast to Baye was made. Here they found the Turks had dynamited the wells, evidently having received news of this march. To mislead the Turks at Marne and Aqaba, Lawrence spread the news that the Arabs were turning north, and to make this seem more probable, he decided to raid the line about 120 miles north near Dira. His real objective was Aqaba via Abu Lisan. On these raids, bridges, rails and telegraph wires were destroyed. A war parley. Here we see a group of Arab leaders discussing their plans for the next move. With hints and skillful persuasion, their plans generally coincided with Lawrence's, but they had the satisfaction of thinking they were carrying out their own ideas. The attack on Abu Lisan, the guard post of Aqaba, was now to be made with a force of roughly 500 Arabs. The railway line was crossed 20 miles south of Marne, where a long stretch of it and 10 bridges were blown up. Abu Lisan. As luck would have it, a battalion of Turks had just been sent to Abu Lisan to reinforce its garrison. Here is a picture of the scene of the battle, afterwards to become Faisal's headquarters. The Turks were in the valley, while the Arabs at night surrounded them, seizing the crests of the hills unobserved. Arab sniping went on all the next day, the Turkish sorties being repulsed. It was terribly hot on the hills, the limestone ridges cutting the naked feet of the Arabs, and the overheated rifles burning their hands. It seemed to be a case of stalemate, when old Auda, with a "get your camel if you want to see the old man's work," to Lawrence, led a mad charge down the slope at the head of his 50 horsemen, straight for the Turks, and shooting from the saddle. 2 or 3 went down. The Turks hesitated, broke, and ran. Meanwhile, Lawrence and 400 camel men dashed down another slope. Lawrence's racing camel outdistanced the others, and he found himself alone among the Turks, firing wildly with his pistol. Suddenly his camel tripped and fell headlong, and Lawrence was torn from the saddle and sent hurtling through the air. He lay stunned in front of his camel, while his followers came charging on. His camel's dead body saved his life by dividing the oncoming streams of frenzied men and camels. The battle was won, and Auda came up, his eyes mad with the light of battle. 6 bullets had drilled his clothing without touching him, but his field glasses, pistol holster, and his sword scabbard were smashed, pierced, and cut to ribbons. His mare had been killed under him. Arab irregulars mounted. Here are some of the horsemen who took part in that heroic battle which decided the fate of Aqaba. The Arabs, with little resistance, reached the pass, pictures of which we shall see later, leading down to the port. Lawrence sent a summons to surrender by a white flag and 2 prisoners, but the Turks shot at both. He then got into touch with a Turkish officer to whom he explained that the Arab forces were growing, that tempers were short, and Aqaba surrendered. On the 6th of July, exactly 2 months after setting out from Wedge, Lawrence and his men dashed into Aqaba in a driving sandstorm. Arriving at Aqaba. This photograph was actually taken at Aqaba during a sandstorm, showing the camels barracking and turning their backs to the storm. Faisal's flag can be seen, swelling with victory. The Arabs, mad with delight, rushed on and splashed into the sea. The Turks seemed dazed at the Arabs' victory and were much relieved when they heard they would be handed over to the British. Arab village near Aqaba. Here is the Gulf of Aqaba, with an Arab village on its eastern side. Aqaba became now an important base for Faisal's army. Lawrence was already busy with plans for its defence. Arab children. Typical Arab children in summer costume, already accustomed to aeroplanes. The Arabs were at first frightened, then fascinated by the aeroplanes. They called them the birds with the explosive eggs, having seen the effects of their bombs. Aqaba from the west. After making arrangements for the defence of Aqaba, Lawrence with a party of 8 Arabs came up this pass on the west of the Gulf on his journey of 168 miles to Egypt to make his report and to get fresh supplies. They were a party of tired men and exhausted camels, but the journey was accomplished in 49 hours, with only 4 short halts. For a European, 40 miles a day is considered good trekking. At Suez, Lawrence arrived verminous and filthy, his clothes sticking to his saddle sores. He had spent weeks of little sleep, poor food, frequent fighting, and never-ceasing anxiety at the hottest time of the year in one of the hottest countries of the world. He weighed only 7 stone, 9 stone being his normal weight. On his way to Cairo, he met Allenby on Ismailia Station, to whom he delivered his important news. Allenby, greatly pleased, asked him what help he needed. "Stores and arms, and a fund of £200,000 in gold to convince my converts," replied Lawrence. Allenby promised to do what he could, and kept his promise. Lawrence and Colonel Joyce. Lawrence returned to Aqaba, where aeroplanes, cars, stores, and gold had arrived. Here, Lawrence, Arab dress, is seen with Colonel Joyce, who undertook to organize the supplies for the Arab army, in addition to his task of training an Arab regular army. This regular Arab army, created under Jafar Pasha, really extended Allenby's far-flung trench line eastwards, while Lawrence was the ever-moving spear point of the attack from the desert side in the north with the revolting tribes. More transport. The motor tenders proved very valuable for lightning raids on the railway. Until his main northern advance could be made, Lawrence satisfied the Arabs' craving for excitement and loot by blowing up trains, bridges, and railway line. As you see, many of them wear the Arab headcloth. The tribes would jeer at their British khaki, but were somewhat appeased by this effort to emulate them. View from air of RAF camp. This is a view taken from the air of the Royal Air Force camp at Aqaba, in charge of Captain Siddons. To the Arabs, they brought the benefits of air raids, photographs of objectives, and quick communication with the British Army. RAF officers. Captain Siddons, centre, and 2 other officers then attached to the Arab Army. The pilots carried a small bag containing 10 sovereigns around their necks, so that in case of a forced landing in the desert, a guide could be bought to take them back to Aqaba. These officers assisted Buxton's Camel Corps in their attack on Madawara Station, at a time when Lawrence decided on the permanent cutting of the railway. RAF outpost at DC. The RAF had their desert post at DC, about 80 miles east of Aqaba. This is a picture of their temporary shelters. There was a good landing ground within easy flying distance of Marne. Marne from the air. News reached Lawrence at Aqaba that the Turks had sent down a whole division to Marne on the railway, where they were erecting an aeroplane station, improving the fortifications, and sending down large supplies of food and ammunition. Our picture shows us Marne station taken from the air at the time of the Turkish occupation. Their defences can be clearly seen. From Marne, they had pushed their way out and now occupied Abu Lissan, possibly with the intention of retaking Aqaba. British air raids were immediately made on Marne and Abu Lissan, while Lawrence and an Arab raiding party were making for the line south of Marne to hold the attentions of the Turks. We will now accompany Lawrence on his journey east to the railway. Camels entering Wadi Itham. Here are the baggage camels, loaded with rations and material for demolitions, entering the famous Wadi Itham, down which Lawrence and his Arabs had charged to the capture of Aqaba. It was the only natural pass due east into Arabia from Aqaba, and the Romans in olden times took great care to guard it, as we see from the remains of the old Roman wall on the right of the picture. Wadi Itham. This is a scene about halfway through the pass. Riding along this path, one feels mystery is ahead. The dark, frowning rocks seem to resent the passing of strangers. The loose stones are troublesome to the camels, and at midday the heat is terrific. The name of El Orance, as the Arabs called Lawrence, was now known throughout Arabia, and they would travel miles to bring their troubles to him. On one of these rides, he settled 12 cases of armed assault, 4 camel thefts, a marriage, a divorce, 14 feuds, 2 cases of evil eye, and a bewitchment. His patience seemed inexhaustible. Mudflats. Leaving the past behind us, we come upon these wonderful mudflats, beloved alike of men, camels, cars, and aeroplanes. The car tracks are plainly visible. The camels leave no tracks on the hard, sun-baked, flaky mud. Our next stopping place will be Rum, a Hueta tribal watering place. Near Rum. We are now entering Rum, one of the most impressive spots in Arabia. The coloured rocks, rising perpendicularly from the flat wadi beds, awe us with their rugged and majestic strength. A number of wells are in the vicinity, and water, which has been caught by the basin-shaped rock tops, trickles out at various points at a height of from 200 to 300 feet above ground level. From Rum, Lawrence and his raiding party made for Madaura station, only to find it too strongly held. They turned south, where they blew up a Turkish troop train. Turkish truck destroyed. The Arabs nicknamed Lawrence the Prince of Dynamite for his explosive energy. This picture illustrates one of the effects. As the Turks tumbled out of the doors of the troop train, they were fired on by Lewis guns, but gaining the shelter of the bank, they put up a stiff fight. A Stokes gun, manned by an Australian, whom Lawrence called Stokes, was brought to bear on them, and the Turks finally surrendered. Victory always undid an Arab force, and they were now raving mad, screaming and looting, each driving his camel laden with spoils westward into the desert. A closer view of the burnt-out truck. It must have been heartbreaking work for the Turks to keep this line in working order. Whilst engaged in blowing up another train, a Turkish colonel in one of the wagons fired point-blank at Lawrence, but the bullet only grazed his hip. Travelling by rail became a great terror for the Turks. Engine drivers went on strike and extra money was paid for the back seats, engines being Lawrence's special target. The shortage in them became acute. A vast sum of money, £20,000, was offered by the Turks for the capture of Lawrence, dead or alive, necessitating his forming a very ferocious and efficient bodyguard, some of whom we shall see in a moment. Lawrence's bodyguard. Dressed in all colours of the rainbow, this bodyguard were ready to give their lives for Lawrence. Because of their colours, they have been likened to a tulip garden. A less complimentary name was given them of Lawrence's cutthroats. They did not presume to wear the white robes of their leader. Hard riders and hard fighters, they were picked men of various tribes, and although they would have broken a British policeman's heart by their wild pranks, they suited the country and the times. Nearly 60 of them died in Lawrence's service. After his train-wrecking exploits, Lawrence returned via Rum to Aqaba to make preparations for his northern campaign. He no longer feared a Turkish attack on Aqaba. Map, second phase. With Damascus as his final objective, Lawrence decided to make Azraq his northern base for operations on the important Turkish railway junction at Derar. He would cut the lines leading to Derar and synchronize his attack with Allenby's advance from the British Jaffa-Jericho line. Once Derar was taken, the Arab army would sweep on as the right flank of the British army up to Damascus. Faisal and the main Arab army would make Abu Lisan, the guard post to Aqaba, their headquarters. Meanwhile, the country between the Dead Sea and the railway must be cleared up, and, in addition, the Syrian tribes must be persuaded to assist the Arabs. No light problem for the ablest general, backed by organized forces. What must it have seemed to a man who must undertake the work of all army departments rolled into one? Between the Dead Sea and the Pilgrims' Railway, the Turks held the country as far south as Kerak, with strong forces still at Man and Medina. Our route now will follow the dotted line to Tafile and the Dead Sea. Faisal and Lawrence. This picture of Faisal and Lawrence was taken at Abu Lisan. They were walking out to inspect Buxton's Camel Corps on their successful return from blowing up Madaura station 120 miles east of Aqaba. Lawrence is here seen in a characteristic attitude, hands clasped in front of him, head bowed in thought. Next to him is Faisal. Their northern campaign, as regards time, must fit in with Allenby's plans, an added difficulty. Suddenly, on the 24th of January, news came that the Turks were advancing in force from Kerak to retake the village of Tafile, previously taken from them by Lawrence and Auda. Petra dwellings. We shall now move north to Tafile, our route taking us through the wonderful Petra. Walled in by towering rocks and watered by a perennial stream, Petra stands in the midst of sharp valleys and dangerous hillsides. Once the site of the famous capital of the Nabateans and the centre of their caravan trade, Petra not only possessed the advantages of a fortress, but controlled the main commercial routes to Gaza in the west, Damascus in the north, the Red Sea to the south, and the Persian Gulf to the east. The rocks are lined with these well-cut tombs and illustrate the Nabatean type of the simple pylon tomb, with a door set in a tower crowned by a parapet in imitation of the front of a dwelling house. Their custom was to bury the dead and offer worship in these half-excavated caves. Their city was built and is estimated to have covered 1¼ square miles, loose boulders of which still remain. Petra Roman carvings. This is a close view of an elaborate facade from which all trace of the native style has vanished, evidently copied from the front of a Roman temple. As we see, it is in a wonderful state of preservation. It is nice to think that the many Arab robbers who must have raided Petra did not damage this beautiful example of Roman carving. These caves had now become the temporary dwellings of wandering Bedouins, animals, and flies. An impressive entrance. The most impressive entrance to Petra is from the east down this dark and narrow gorge, in places only 10 to 12 feet wide. It is called the Sikh shaft, a split in the huge sandstone rocks, which serves as the waterway of the Wadi Musa. No one who has visited Petra is likely to forget the wonderful colours reflected by these rocks as the sun moves from east to west, or for the sake of accuracy, the land moves from west to east. We will now climb to the top of Mount Horan, the traditional site of Aaron's tomb. Aaron's tomb. The inhabitants of neighbouring villages state this is Aaron's tomb, and it is still visited as such by pilgrims, the number of whom are few owing to the activity of Bedouin robbers. Some authorities state that he died at Moserra and not at Petra. Anyway, it is some satisfaction to know that such a fine tomb still keeps in remembrance the traditional founder and head of the Jewish priesthood, who, in company with Moses, led the Israelites out of Egypt. We must now hasten to the village of Tafile, where the peasants were in a panic by the news of the Turkish advance. Tafile. A Turkish general with 900 infantry, 100 cavalry, 27 machine guns and 2 mountain howitzers were descending on the village you see here. During the night, the villagers were busily clearing out their movable goods, and Lawrence, up all night making preparations, was in a furious temper at the Turks, wanting this village, of no earthly use to them. He would give them the pitched battle they did not expect. He decided to hold the northern cliffs of the valley, sending forward 2 automatic guns to test the strength and disposition of the enemy. Some of the Arabs were placed on the ridge tops, as if they were the lookouts of a big force behind, and incidentally to draw the fire of the Turkish guns. Lawrence then sent out flanking parties who knew every ridge and hollow. These crept to within 300 yards of the Turks and opened fire as the Arab main body charged at the Turkish centre. The Turks collapsed, turned and streamed back to Kerak, followed by a body of Armenian villagers howling for vengeance, while Arab peasants shot down the Turks as they ran. Report states that only 50 exhausted Turks of the whole brigade got safely back. View towards the Dead Sea. After the Battle of Tafile, Lawrence, with the help of the chief of the Beersheba Bedouin, organized a raid on some Turkish supply ships at anchor in a little port at the southeast of the Dead Sea. This is a view taken from the Arabian mountains, looking towards the Dead Sea. At dawn, the Arabs, in a sudden charge, surprised the sailors asleep on the beach, scuttled the boats and looted the port. They took 60 prisoners, burned the storehouse, and escaped without any loss to themselves. Lawrence, ironically, recommended himself for the naval DSO to counter the military DSO, already awarded him, quoting this as one of the few cases in British history where mounted men had fought and sunk a fleet. GHQ, beginning to know Lawrence, saw the joke. ICC crossing the Jordan. While Lawrence was battling at Tafile, Allenby had sent the Imperial Camel Corps across the Jordan to capture Es-Salt and possibly Amman, situated in the hills to the east. Here are some of the camels with full marching kit crossing the Jordan over a pontoon bridge. The attempt was costly and unsuccessful, largely owing to the Beni Sakr tribe failing to fulfill their promised extravagant help. There was no Lawrence to act as the all-important connecting link. We will now return to Lawrence at his northern base at Azraq, some 60 miles east of Amman. Lawrence and bodyguard. Here is Lawrence and his bodyguard at Muaka, between Azraq and the railway line. He was arranging with Buxton to blow up a bridge over which he had just seen a train pass. The line, some 12 miles away, could be seen from this point. At Azraq, the Deraa expedition was now almost complete. Lawrence's plan being to isolate Deraa by cutting the line north, west and south. His tactics would be tip and run, and not the regular advance of an organized army. He must get the support of the tribes in the Huran, a fertile plain south of Damascus, to lessen the risk of failure. To this end, he and his agents paid them visits. Farhad of the Beni Sakr. On these northern raids, Lawrence was helped by the Beni Sakr. This is a picture drawn from life by Eric Kennington of Farhad of the Beni Sakr tribe. On one occasion, Lawrence had just pressed his exploder when he was sent spinning backwards, a piece of metal from the engine gashing his left arm and ripping his shirt to the shoulder. As he was hobbling back, the Turks opened fire and he fell. The Beni Sakr picked Lawrence up and hurried him to shelter. His clothes ripped to pieces, and with 5 different bullet wounds, none of them serious. Farhad was missing. His belt and rifle were shown to Lawrence as proof of his death. One Arab dashed off among the Turks, dragging Farhad, badly wounded in the face, but alive. Junor and his plane. As a retaliation to these raids, 8 enemy aeroplanes flew out from Deraa, machine gunning and dropping bombs on the Arabs. Junor, the British pilot you see here, with the only available British machine, an ancient BE-12, suddenly sailed in and rattled away at the 8 enemy planes. They scattered for a careful look, and Junor flew westward with the Turks in pursuit, the chance of an air fight causing them to forget their ground target. Lawrence and 350 regular Arabs hurriedly crossed the line, making for their objective west of Deraa. To their astonishment, Junor appeared, still alive, surrounded by 3 enemy planes, spitting bullets at him. Junor threw out a message to say his petrol was finished and a landing ground was hurriedly cleared of boulders. Junor dived, and as he reached the ground his plane was turned over, throwing him out with nothing worse than a cut chin. He just managed to save his gun and ammunition when the Turks dived and bombed the wreck. Effect of an aeroplane bomb. Here is the effect of a bomb dropped in the desert, earning the apt name of explosive eggs from the Arabs. The surprise of the Arabs may be imagined when a big Handley Page later landed at Azraq, bringing the amazing news of Allenby's victory. The first Arab to see it raced southward, yelling out, "The biggest airplane in the world!" Others surrounded it, saying, "Indeed, and at last they have sent us the aeroplane, of which these others were foals." Station destroyed. Before this welcome news had arrived, the line south had been permanently cut. How thoroughly this was done may be seen from this picture. The Arabs had succeeded in isolating Deraa when the news arrived of Allenby's great advance, and Deraa was occupied with little resistance, the Turks retreating in confusion towards Damascus. The task now set by Allenby was to harass the Turkish Fourth Army and to cut it up on its retreat north. Arab regulars with Faisal's banner. Here are some of the Arab regulars advancing north with Faisal's banner. In their retreat, the panic-stricken Turks were slaughtering innocent Arab women and children, and in turn being killed by the infuriated Arab army. The story of Talal, the Arab sheikh who had seen the mutilated bodies of his tribe, men, women and children, foully murdered in the village of Tafas, must forever live in the history of the Arabs. In the words of Robert Graves, he gave one moan, then rode to the upper ground, shivering and staring at the retreating Turks. Lawrence moved near to speak to him, but Alder restrained him with a hand on his reins. Very slowly, Talal drew his headcloth about his face, then seemed to take hold of himself, and galloped, headlong, bending low and swaying in the saddle, right at the main body of the enemy. It was a long ride, down a gentle slope and across a hollow. Both armies waited for him. Firing had stopped on both sides, and the noise of his horse's hooves sounded unnaturally loud as he rushed on. Only a few lengths from the enemy, he sat up in the saddle and shouted his war cry, "Talal, Talal," twice, in a tremendous voice. Instantly, the Turkish rifles and machine guns crashed out, and he and his mare fell, riddled through and through among the lance points. Alder looked cold and grim. "God give him mercy," he said. "We will take his price." For the first time in the war, Lawrence gave the order, "No prisoners." The Turkish Fourth Army was practically annihilated, and the war was over. Entering Damascus. Here are the Arab horsemen entering Damascus, and the Arab flag was set up on the town hall as the last Turkish and German troops marched out. It is said that the hindmost general saluted it ironically. Before the British made their own official entry, an Arab government had been quickly organized, and the town was once more peaceful. No mean task for Lawrence with his excitable warriors. Lawrence's wish of seeing the Arabs masters in Damascus had been realized, and he now set himself the task of guarding their interests at the peace conferences. We will now leave Arabia in the hands of the politicians, taking a farewell look at a typical Arab wadi. A typical Arab wadi, affording the Bedouin a secure and unenvied freedom for many generations to come. An Arab fortification. The tribal scattered fortifications with their Arabic inscriptions shown on one of the stones are still likely to be used for their never-ending tribal raids. An Arab at peace. An Arab once more at peace with his cup of sweetened coffee. The town Arabs are now free of the heavy taxation regularly collected by the Turks. The desert Arabs seldom paid taxation owing to the cost of collection. As the Arabs themselves would never write a history of the Arab Revolt, Lawrence wrote his splendid book of the Revolt, The 7 Pillars of Wisdom, which will probably be available to the public after Lawrence's death. Graves states that Lawrence was so keen to do things well that he actually spent £13,000 on the edition. The reproduction of the pictures alone cost more than the subscriptions, leaving himself £10,000 out of pocket. For these pictures, the best artists were employed under the art editorship of Eric Kennington, who went personally to Transjordania to draw portraits of Arabs, some of which he has kindly allowed us to reproduce as slides. Our last 3 slides are portraits by Eric Kennington. You have already seen 2 other portraits of his, Abdullah and Farhad. Mutar al-Hamud of the Beni Hassan. A good example of Kennington's work, showing how the Arab's headcloth provides valuable protection from the rays of the sun. Physically, the desert Arabs have few equals, and their ability to ride day after day with little food was no small factor in keeping the Turks in everlasting surprise and suspense, never knowing where and when they would be raided. Alian, a spy. This is a portrait of Alian, a spy, his deceitful expression being well caught by the artist. On one occasion, Lawrence overheard, by lifting a tent flap, a plot to betray him, and he lost no time in making his escape. It was fortunately a rare breach of the Arabs' strict code of hospitality that the hand of friendship should be extended to those who had broken bread in their tents. Mahmas. Mahmas, a camel boy, was generally in trouble from his uncontrollable temper. At times he was not sane. Here is a description of Mahmas by Graves. Mahmas would have been called a homicidal maniac. If he was worsted in argument or laughed at, or even for a mere fancy, he would lean forward with his little dagger and rip the other man up. 3 men at least he had killed so. Once, Lawrence had the unpleasant task of disarming him when he was running amok. Without knowing his history, one of the men chosen by Kennington for his portrait was Mahmas, and as he was working on the portrait, he noticed the whites of Mahmas's eyes turning up queerly and his face going insane, and suddenly he was on Kennington with his dagger raised. Kennington pretended to pay no attention, but stooped carelessly to pick up a piece of chalk. This saved his life. The madness died, and Mahmas was as friendly as he had been before the attack. Kennington sketched in the dagger as a comment on the occasion. Unfortunately, this slide does not show the dagger which Kennington drew in the right hand of Mahmas. After the revolt, Lawrence and Churchill at the Colonial Office worked together in the cause of the Arabs, with the result that a happy solution to their peacetime problems was reached. Faisal was duly crowned king of Iraq. His brother Abdullah became king of Transjordania. Said, a younger brother, became an undergraduate at Balliol, while Faisal's son was sent to an English public school. Iraq is now an independent Arab sovereign state. The provisions of its treaty with Great Britain include the acceptance of British advisors, a military guarantee, and various degrees of assistance. Ibn Saud, of the Central Oasis, turned Hussein out of Mecca and has become the most important ruler in Arabia. In connection with these lectures, Lawrence very kindly wrote to me in March 1928, extracts of which are quoted, and I think we shall agree that the Arab revolt, with the subsequent British policy, was fully justified, and that T.E. Shaw will live in history as Lawrence of Arabia.